The voice in the snow. Easy now. Dusty. Ain't no use complaining about it. William Chase leaned into the wind, one hand gripping the reins, the other pressed flat against the mare's neck to feel the warmth still pulsing beneath her winter coat. Snow drove sideways across the open range, thick as cotton batting, stinging any patch of skin fool enough to be exposed. February 14th, 1883, Valentine's Day on the Colorado frontier, and the whole territory lay locked under a sky that hadn't shown blue in a week. Now, you have to understand something about Valentine's Day out here in 1883. It wasn't cards and candy. It wasn't parlor talk or pressed flowers for a ranch hand riding fence line before dawn. It was just another cold morning with nobody waiting at the other end of it. William was 31 years old. He owned a folding knife, 2 shirts, and $14 tucked inside his left boot. The horse was borrowed. The saddle was borrowed. The work was honest but thin, checking Harlan McBride's north fence for breaks, and it paid just enough to keep a man in coffee and beans through winter. He didn't mind the solitude most days. A man alone long enough stops noticing what hurts, the same way a hand held over a candle long enough stops feeling the heat. It just becomes the shape of things. Dusty stopped. William nudged her flanks. She planted her hooves and refused to move, ears pinned forward, nostrils flaring wide. She was a steady mare, not prone to nonsense. And when Dusty stopped walking, a wise man paid attention. He squinted through the white curtain of snow. Nothing. Then the wind shifted direction for half a breath, and he heard it. A sound so thin and small it could have been a bird caught in wire, but it wasn't a bird. William swung down and waded forward, snow to his thighs. His boot struck something soft beneath the crust. He knelt and swept the snow aside with both hands, and what he found there stopped his heart cold in his chest. A girl, 8 years old, maybe. Her arms locked around a smaller boy like she'd been forged that way. Her body curved over his in a shield that must have held for hours. Both of them were the color of old ash. Frost beaded on the girl's lashes. Her lips had gone past blue into something closer to gray, and her fingers where they gripped her brother's coat were stiff and white, but her eyes were open. Barely. They found William's face through the snow, and in them was a look that would follow him for the rest of his natural life. Not fear, not pain. Something worse. The quiet surrender of a child who has been brave long past the point where bravery matters. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked like thin ice. "Don't leave us too." William had his coat off before the words finished leaving her mouth. He wrapped them both together, lifting the boy first. Lord, the child weighed nothing, a bundle of bones and wet wool. Then the girl. She couldn't stand, so he carried her too. One child in each arm, his chest exposed to the blizzard in nothing but a cotton shirt. "Your folks," he said, his teeth already chattering. "Where are your folks, sweetheart?" The girl pressed her face against his neck. Her skin was so cold it burned. "Mama and Papa got sick," she said. "They didn't wake up." Influenza. He'd heard it was tearing through the homesteads east of the river, taking whole families in a matter of days. These children had walked out of that nightmare. 2 days in country that would kill a grown man in half the time. William mounted with both children held against his body. Dusty turned south without being asked, and he gave the mare her head because his hands were full of something more important than reins. Through the wall of white. 3 miles distant, a single light burned. Rebecca Walsh's clinic, the only lamp lit in all of Cedar Bluff at this hour. William Chase rode toward it like everything that mattered was waiting on the other side of that glow. The nurse's hands. The door crashed open and winter poured inside like a living thing. Rebecca Walsh was on her feet before the snow settled on her floorboards. She'd been reading by the stove, a Philadelphia medical journal 3 months old, and the sudden blast of cold scattered the pages across the room like startled birds. Then she saw the man in her doorway, coatless, shaking so hard his jaw was locked, holding 2 children against his chest as if they were the last precious things left in the world. "Found 'em in the snow," he said through clenched teeth. "North Range. Their folks are gone. They ain't got nobody." Rebecca didn't ask how or why or what happened. She cleared the examination table with one sweep of her arm, sending instruments clattering, and took the boy first because his color was worse. Skin like tallow. Fingers rigid and white to the second knuckle. Frostbite. 2nd degree at minimum. His breathing came in shallow, irregular pulls that told her his body was shutting down systems to protect the core. "Stoke that fire as high as it'll go," she said, already cutting the boy's frozen shirt away with scissors. "Then tear those sheets on the top shelf into strips, wide as your hand." The cowboy moved without a word. She noticed that most men would have stood in her doorway asking questions she didn't have time to answer. This one simply obeyed, his rough hands handling the cloth with a care that seemed bred into the bone. Rebecca worked the way she'd been trained at Philadelphia Women's Medical College. Heated stones wrapped in flannel, positioned along the torso. Warm water, never hot, to coax circulation back into frozen extremities without shocking the tissue. She checked pulses, examined fingertips and toes for the blackening that meant tissue death, listened through her stethoscope for the wet crackle that would mean fluid in the lungs. The boy's breathing faltered, stopped, stuttered back. Rebecca repositioned him, elevating his chest, pressing a warm compress against the pulse point at his neck. She counted. 3 breaths. 4. 5. The rhythm caught and held. She allowed herself 1 exhale. 1. It had been 3 years since James. 3 years since pneumonia had taken the man she'd planned to marry. And the particular cruelty of being a nurse who couldn't save the person she loved most had carved her so hollow that she'd filled the empty space with nothing but work. 14-hour days, house calls and blizzards, anything to keep her hands too busy for grief. These were the first children she'd treated since. Her hands remembered what to do. Her heart was less certain. "Ma'am." The cowboy stood beside her, cloth strips in his fists, waiting for instruction. "Rebecca," she said. "Rebecca Walsh. I need you to stay the night. Both children require constant warming. And I cannot do it alone," he nodded once, sat down on the stool beside the girl's cot, took the child's small bandaged hand between both of his, those cracked and calloused ranch fingers closing around her palm with a gentleness that made Rebecca's hands pause mid-task. She stood there, compressed in her grip, watching a cowboy hold a stranger's child, like she was his own. "William Chase," he said quietly. "I ain't going nowhere." The first night, the hours between midnight and dawn moved like cold honey. William watched Rebecca work through the small hours with a focus that never wavered. She checked pulses every 20 minutes, replaced cooled stones with warm ones from the fire, adjusted the children's positions, tested their fingers for sensation, made small notes in a leather-bound book she kept at her station. Every motion was precise and unhurried. She knew exactly what these children needed, and she gave it without rest or complaint. William knew horses. He knew fence posts and the price of hay in February, and how to sleep on frozen ground and rise before dawn, ready to work. He did not know the first thing about keeping a child alive, and that knowledge sat heavy in his stomach. "I ain't much use to you in here," he said quietly. Some time passed too. I don't know what half these instruments do. Rebecca looked up from the boy's chart. Can you hold him? Hold him. She lifted the boy and placed him against William's chest, tucking a warmed blanket around them both. Body heat. Yours runs hotter than any stone I can warm. Just hold him steady and keep him close. So William held the boy. The child weighed nothing at all, maybe 40 pounds of bone and shallow breath. Small enough to fit inside the circle of William's arms with room to spare. He could feel the boy's heartbeat through his own shirt, thin and quick, like a sparrow trapped under glass. William pressed his chin to the top of the child's head. The hair smelled like snow and wood smoke, and something underneath that was just the smell of a small boy who needed to be warm. What are their names? William asked. She told me earlier. The girl is Clara, 8. The boy is Elijah, 6. Their family homesteaded east of the river. William tightened his arms. 6 years old. Elijah was 6 years old, and he'd spent 2 days in a blizzard that would have killed most men by nightfall. Sometime before dawn. Clara woke. Her eyes found William in the lamplight, and she reached out one hand, the fingers still wrapped in Rebecca's careful bandages, and seized his finger. Gripped it the way a drowning person grips a rope. Then her eyes closed again, and she fell back into sleep, still holding on. William sat motionless for 2 hours, his back locked into a slow, burning ache. His left arm went numb under Elijah's weight. He did not shift. He did not adjust. He barely breathed. Because the girl was holding his finger and the boy was pressed against his heart and moving, even an inch, was something William Chase found he could not do. Rebecca watched from across the room. She said nothing, but she saw a man who had turned to stone before he disturbed a sleeping child. And something behind her, careful, professional composure, gave way. Just a fraction. Just enough. Dawn touched the window glass. Gray light on white snow. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and both children breathed in steady rhythm. Their color no longer the terrible ash of the snowbank, but something warmer. Something closer to living. William looked down at Claire's fingers wrapped around his. He thought about the fence line, about his bunk, about his $14 and his borrowed saddle, and the simple fact that nobody in this world expected William Chase to be anywhere, or do anything, or stay. He couldn't leave. The thought of standing up and walking out that door hit him like a physical wall. Something had taken root. In that chair, in those 2 still hours, and William understood, with a certainty that frightened him clear to his boots, that he would not be riding away from this. Fever and fire. The boy's fever came on like a brush fire. Rebecca had warned William it could happen. Exposure weakened the body's defenses, she explained, and secondary infections could set in even after the initial crisis had passed. She'd been watching for it. But when the mercury in her thermometer climbed past 104 degrees just after dawn on the second day, the speed of it still stole her breath. She stripped the warming compresses away and replaced them with cool cloths wrung in water from the basin, willow bark tea, half a teaspoon at a time, coaxed between Elijah's cracked lips with a patience that had to be ironed because anything less would break. She counted his respirations every 5 minutes. She calculated odds in her head that she would never say aloud. Now, you have to understand what 48 hours without sleep does to 2 people. It strips away every mask a person wears, every polite distance, every careful wall built between the self and the world. What's left underneath is either something worth seeing, or it's nothing at all. William could not help with the medicine. He knew it. The knowing burned in him like swallowed smoke, but Clara was awake and sitting up in her cot, watching her brother with eyes that held too much knowledge for 8 years of living. She hadn't spoken more than whispered answers since the snowbank. Her body was recovering. Her spirit was somewhere else entirely. William sat on the floor beside her cot, cross-legged, hat off. He didn't plan what came out of his mouth. "You ever hear about a horse named Biscuit?" Clara shook her head, a tiny motion. "Well, Biscuit was about the orneriest mare in the whole Colorado Territory. She'd bite your hat clean off your head if you wasn't paying attention. One time she got into the foreman's office and ate his whole ledger. Chewed it up, numbers and all. The foreman came in and found her standing there with ink on her lips, looking pleased as punch. He talked for an hour, made up more than half of it. Biscuit and the runaway chicken. Biscuit and the Sunday hat she stole from the preacher's wife. Biscuit and the time she drank a whole bucket of coffee and ran circles around the corral until sundown." Clara's eyes drifted from her brother to William's face. "And somewhere in the middle of Biscuit's war with a stubborn barn cat," she laughed, just once, a small startled sound, like a window opening in a house that had been shut up tight. Rebecca was elbow deep in crisis, but she heard that laugh across the room, and her hands went still for one beat. She looked over and saw this rough-handed cowboy sitting on her clinic floor, making shadow shapes on the wall with his fingers, drawing a sound out of a terrified child that no medicine could produce. James could quote Tennyson at a dinner table. He had never once sat on a floor to make a frightened child laugh. Near midnight, the fever broke. Rebecca felt it under her palm. That subtle cooling, the skin beneath her touch shifting from burning paper to something human. Elijah's breathing deepened, steadied, found its natural rhythm like a horse settling into a comfortable gait. Rebecca's knees buckled, not dramatically, just a small, sideways sway, her body surrendering the tension it had held for 2 days. William's hand caught her elbow. His grip was steady and warm and absolutely sure. "He's gonna be all right," she whispered. Her voice shook for the first time. William said quietly, "Because of you, Rebecca." She let herself lean into his steadiness, just for a moment, just long enough to remember what it felt like when you didn't have to carry everything alone. What hands? Revealed the second night settled over Cedar Bluff like a held breath. Both children slept now, truly slept, not the shallow, frightening unconsciousness of before, but the deep, surrendered rest of small bodies that had finally decided they were safe. Clara lay on her side with one arm flung across her brother. Elijah had his thumb in his mouth. They breathed together in a rhythm that filled the quiet room like a slow heartbeat. William sat on one side of the cot. Rebecca sat on the other. A candle burned low between them on the bedside table. The stove ticked with settling coals. Outside, the wind had stopped sometime in the last hour, and the silence it left behind was so complete that Rebecca could hear the snow falling, a soft, continuous whisper, like the world was trying to say something gentle. For a long while, neither of them spoke. They had been awake for nearly 50 hours, and exhaustion had burned through every layer of small talk and polite distance and careful composure. What remained was raw, closer to bone. "His name's Elijah," Rebecca said softly. "She told me his favorite thing is birds. He collects feathers. She said their mother used to help him press them in a book." William nodded slowly. "And Clara wants to be a doctor. She told me while you were riding to check on Dusty." Rebecca's mouth curved. "She asked me how long it takes to learn. I told her a long time. She said she didn't mind." The silence between them shifted. It loosened. Rebecca leaned back in her chair instead of sitting rigid at the edge, and William's breathing slowed into something that matched the quiet room. Small changes, the kind only a person paying close attention would notice. James died 3 winters ago, Rebecca said. She hadn't planned to speak his name. It came out the way a splinter works itself free, slow and sharp and somehow a relief. Pneumonia. I sat with him for 6 days, and I used everything I knew, and it wasn't enough. I haven't spoken his name out loud in over a year. William studied his hands, the knuckles, the calluses, the dirt that never quite came out of the creases. I ain't got a story like that, he said. Never had nobody to lose. Been on my own since I was 14. Ranch work since I could sit a horse. Never owned land. Never had anybody waiting for me somewhere. He said it plain, the way he said everything. No self-pity, no bitterness. Just the shape of a life laid out like a hand of cards. Rebecca looked down at the blanket between them. His hands rested there, rough, enormous, cracked across every knuckle. Hers lay nearby, slim, steady, still faintly stained with willow bark. Inches apart. Neither reached. Neither pulled away. I never had anybody teach me what a family looks like, William said. Rebecca met his eyes in the candlelight. Maybe nobody teaches it. Maybe you just know it when you see it plain. The candle guttered and steadied. The children breathed. Somewhere outside, a barn owl called once and fell silent. Clara murmured in her sleep, one word, soft as the snow falling beyond the window. Mama, Rebecca's breath caught. William went perfectly still. The word hung in the dim room between them, small and enormous at the same time, and neither of them corrected it. Neither of them moved. They just sat there, on opposite sides of two sleeping children, and let the words settle over them like something warm and terrifying and true. The gap between their hands on the blanket was less than an inch now. Neither of them closed it. Neither of them needed to. They both knew it was already gone. The morning after, William rode out at first light because the walls of that clinic were starting to feel like something he could not afford. The children were stable. Claire had color in her cheeks and was helping Rebecca fold bandages with a concentration that bordered on fierce. Elijah had found a sparrow feather on the windowsill, brought in somehow on the draft, and was turning it over in his fingers with quiet absorption. Rebecca had given William her late fiancé's coat. It was too tight across the shoulders, but it was warm. Mrs. Harrigan from the general store had brought a pot of chicken broth that morning. Unprompted, left it on the clinic step with a note that said simply, "For the little ones, God bless." It was a small thing, but it was the first sign that Cedar Bluff knew what had happened, and that the town was paying attention. The county clerk's office sat 4 miles south. William rode there on Dusty, wearing Clara's brass button pinned to the borrowed coat because she'd insisted. "For luck, Mr. William." He'd thanked her like she'd handed him a gold piece. The clerk was sympathetic but had nothing to offer. No records of kin in 2 counties. No relatives. The homestead east of the river was confirmed abandoned. Neighbors had found the parents. The children were, in every legal and practical sense, alone in the world. William rode back slow. The snow had stopped overnight, and the valley stretched out white and silent under a sky so clean it hurt to look at. Beautiful country, hard country, the kind that didn't care whether you were rich or poor, brave or afraid. It just kept being itself and let you figure out the rest. At the clinic, Elijah was sitting on the front step, waiting. The boy had a feather in his hand. He held it up as William dismounted, and for a long moment he didn't speak, just looked at William with those enormous brown eyes, steady and patient, as if he were studying something important. "Mr. William," Elijah said. His voice was small and clear. "Are we staying here?" William crouched down in the snow so their eyes were level. The boy's face held no fear. Just a question that deserved an honest answer from an honest man. I don't rightly know yet, son. Elijah considered this. Then he held the feather out, offering it the way a child offers a sacrament. This is for you. I found it. William took the feather, a sparrow feather, brown and plain and ordinary. He tucked it carefully into his shirt pocket, next to his heart, the way a man handles something that matters. Inside the clinic, Clara had arranged herself beside Rebecca with such natural ease they might have always been together. Rebecca was teaching her the figure-8 bandage pattern, firm but not too tight, and Clara's small hands mimicked the motion with the same fierce concentration Rebecca herself wore when she worked. No relatives, William told Rebecca quietly, by the stove. Nobody at all. Rebecca nodded. She'd expected it. Her eyes moved to the children, Clara demonstrating her bandage technique to Elijah, who watched with his thumb in his mouth and his new feather tucked behind his ear. William watched too, and the ground beneath his feet shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the mud and everything to do with the fact that he was looking at something he wanted so badly, it terrified him. What a poor man owns. William emptied his pockets onto the hay bale in the livery stable. $14 in worn bills, a folding knife with a loose hinge, Clara's brass button, Elijah's sparrow feather. He laid them out in a row, side by side, and stared at the sum total of 31 years of living. The logical part of his mind, the part that had kept him fed through drought and hard winters and wages that barely covered beans, laid out the argument plain. You got no business raising children. You can't cover the deposit on a proper room. A judge would take one look at you and laugh. You're a ranch hand. William, that's all you've ever been and all you're likely to be. He picked up the button, turned it in his fingers. Clara had placed it in his palm that afternoon with the gravity of a judge handing down a verdict. For luck, Mr. William. She'd said it like she believed luck was real, like she believed a brass button could change the course of things. He picked up the feather. Elijah hadn't said a word when he offered it, hadn't needed to. The boy just held it out and waited, and when William took it, something had passed between them that didn't require language. $14, a knife, a button, a feather. This was William Chase. This was everything he had. He closed his hand around the button and the feather together, and he held them the way you hold something that matters more than money. Across town, Rebecca sat in the chair beside the sleeping children and caught herself humming. She stopped, startled. She hadn't hummed in 3 years, not since James. The sound had come out of her, the way Clara's laugh had come out of Clara, involuntary and unexpected and so natural that it almost hurt. Elijah slept with his thumb in his mouth and his feather tucked under his cheek. Clara had one arm flung out, palm open, reaching toward the chair where William usually sat. Even in sleep, she was looking for him. Rebecca stared at that reaching hand and felt the careful architecture of 3 years of solitude tremble, wanting something again. After the walls she'd built from grief and work and quiet competence was like stepping out onto ice in spring. She knew what it sounded like when ice gave way. She knew the sound a heart made when it broke at 3 in the morning in a room where someone should have been breathing but wasn't. But Clara's hand was reaching, and Elijah slept with a feather he'd given away and gotten back pressed against his face. And somewhere in a livery stable, a man with $14 was holding a brass button like it was the deed to a kingdom. The truth was simpler than any of them wanted to admit. These children didn't need wealth or a proper parlor or a name on a deed. They needed someone who stayed, someone who came back, someone who answered when they called out in the dark. Dawn light began to seep through the windows. Pale, thin, new, William walked toward the clinic. His boots crunched on the frost. Each step steady, each step deliberate. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say. He only knew he was finished running from the only thing that had ever felt like it mattered. The clinic door opened before he reached the step. Rebecca stood in the doorway, lamplight behind her, as if she'd been waiting, as if she'd heard his boots on the frost and known. She looked at his face. He looked at hers. And neither of them needed to speak to understand that they had arrived at the same place by different roads. Richness of character. I know I ain't got no right to be standing here saying this. William was in the doorway, hat in his hands, knuckles white on the brim. Clara's button was in his pocket. Elijah's feather was in his shirt. $14 was in his boot. And every scrap of courage William Chase had ever earned in 31 years of living was gathered up in his throat, trying to become words. I know how it looks. A man with nothing coming to talk about raising children. But those two in there... His voice caught like a rope on a nail. He steadied it. They need a home. I ain't got land. I ain't got savings worth the name. But I'll work myself to the bone. Rebecca, any job, every job. I'll build something from nothing if I got to. I want to take them. Rebecca stood in the morning light. Her face held the exhaustion of 5 days without proper sleep. And beneath it, something else. A steadiness. A resolve that William had only seen when she was fighting for a child's life. They need parents. William, she said quietly. Plural. The word landed like a stone in still water. I have a medical income, she continued. Steady. Enough for a family. She paused. Not for drama. For breath, for the courage to say the next part. And I've been alone since James died. 3 years of filling every hour with work so I wouldn't have to sit in the silence of that empty house. William gripped his hat tighter. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Rebecca stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. You asked if I'd marry a poor ranch hand to raise orphans. Her voice was steady and warm and held no uncertainty at all. I'd marry a good man who rushes 2 children to safety through a blizzard with no coat on his back, who sits up all night holding a boy he never met, who makes a terrified girl laugh when nothing else in this world could. She reached out and placed her hand over his where it gripped the hat brim. Her fingers were warm and sure. That's not poverty, William. That's richness of character. William stared at her hand on his. Something gave way behind his ribs, not painfully. The way ice breaks on a river when spring finally comes. His fingers released the hat brim and turned over beneath hers, and his hand closed around her fingers and held on. A sound from the hallway. Small bare feet on wooden boards. Elijah appeared first. He crossed the room without hesitation and pressed himself against William's leg, one small arm wrapping around the man's knee, his face buried in the worn fabric of William's trousers. No words. Just contact. Just a boy who had found the person he intended to hold on to. Clara came behind him, standing in the doorway with that fierce, old soul expression. She looked at William. She looked at Rebecca. She looked at their joined hands. Then she walked forward and took Rebecca's free hand in her right and William's free hand in her left, and she pulled them all together into a circle that closed like a door shutting against the cold. 4 people in a square of morning light. No one letting go. Valentine's Day, William said. His voice was rough and cracked and halfway to something that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. Of all the days, Rebecca smiled, the full, unguarded, completely undefended smile that William had never seen before. and would spend the rest of his life trying to earn again. I can't think of a better one. Valentine's morning, again February 14th, 1888, William Chase woke to the smell of flapjacks and the sound of an argument about syrup. Elijah, you cannot pour that much. There will be none left for anyone else. I barely used any Clara. You always say that, and it's never true. Both of you hush up. Your father's still sleeping. Rebecca's voice, threaded with the kind of laughter she no longer bothered to hide. William lay still with his eyes closed, listening. 5 years of mornings in this cabin, and the sound of his family's voices before dawn still struck him as something borrowed, something he'd been given by accident and kept expecting someone to take back. The cabin was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a porch. He'd built himself with lumber from the McBride mill. From the outside, it wasn't much to look at. But inside, every wall told a story if you knew how to read it. Claire's drawings tacked above the stove, each one more detailed than the last. The recent ones showing herbs and anatomy sketches because the girl was 13 now and still wanted to be a doctor, and Rebecca was teaching her everything she knew. Elijah's feather collection lined up along the windowsill in careful order, labeled in his own handwriting. He was 11 and already showing signs of the quiet, steady man he would become. A framed marriage certificate hung by the door. February 18th, 1883. 4 days after a cowboy found 2 children in a snowbank. Rebecca's medical bag hung on its hook. She still nursed the town, still had the steadiest hands in Cedar Bluff. But she came home now. Every evening. That was the difference. That was everything. William swung out of bed and pulled on his boots, foreman of his own small spread. 40 acres, a modest herd, a barn he'd raised with help from neighbors who had once called him the poorest man in the valley. Not rich, would never be, but honest, steady, his. He walked into the kitchen, and Clara placed something on the table. Her expression was that same fierce concentration she'd worn at 8 years old, bandaging her first patient in Rebecca's clinic. She'd carried it forward into everything she did. A Valentine card, handmade, brown paper, cut with care, decorated with wildflowers she'd pressed and saved from last summer. The petals were thin and translucent, and they caught the lamplight like stained glass. William picked it up. The paper crackled softly under his fingers, and the faint, sweet smell of dried larkspur rose from the pressed flowers. He read the words Clara had written in her careful, slanting hand. To our parents who found us in the snow. His hands trembled. Those hands that had pulled 2 frozen children from a snowbank, that had held a dying boy against his chest through the longest night of his life, that had built fence and cabin wall and a world from nothing but stubbornness and love. They shook like leaves in a wind. Rebecca placed her hand over his, the same gesture from that first night in the clinic, her steady fingers settling over his rough ones. But now the gesture carried 5 years inside it. 5 years of midnight fevers and first days of school and arguments about syrup and quiet evenings on the porch. Watching the sun drop behind mountains that belonged to no one and everyone. Elijah looked up from his plate, syrup on his chin, feather tucked behind his ear. Same as always. You all right, Pa? William pressed the card to his chest, held it there against the place where a brass button and a sparrow feather had once been, the most valuable things he owned. I'm all right, son. I'm just fine. Folks in town used to say William Chase was the poorest man in the valley. I reckon some of them probably still do. But I want to tell you something that I know to be true. Anyone who sat at that kitchen table on a Valentine's morning would have known different. The strongest marriages aren't built in parlors or churches or in the easy days when everything's going right. They're built in the worst hours of the longest nights, When two people see each other stripped of everything, clear down to the bone, and choose to stay, William stayed, Rebecca stayed, and two children who lost everything in a snowbank found the one thing most people spend their whole lives searching for outside the window. Snow fell gentle and quiet over Cedar Bluff, but inside that cabin, the fire was warm, the table was full, and every chair was filled. Not a single gap left, not one.